Здравейте, това е Легенди, аз съм Георги Харизанов. Днес с Веселин Вълчев продължаваме с нашите международни епизоди за политика и с огромно удоволствие ви представям от североизточен Охайо в Съединените американски щати Джонатан Jakubowski. Hello, Jonathan. We are very glad having you here. So thank you very much for your time and that you have accepted our invitation, and today we will be able to make this transocean political talk with you. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I was just telling you I need to learn some Bulgarian, and I understood Jonathan Jakubowski in Ohio. So how's that for a start?
Yeah. Yeah, 3 words. And not bad. I've seen worse.
You gotta start somewhere.
Yeah. So, as your resume is quite important for the people to know who are they listening to, because we know each other, but we'll talk about it later. I'll read it. I'll read it a little bit because I want to be very on point. So, Jonathan Jakubowski is the author of award-winning book that has gained national attention, Jonathan and Bellwether Blues, A Conservative Awakening of the Millennial Soul, have been featured on the Rush Limbaugh Show, Newsmax, the Washington Times, Newsweek, the New York Times, BBC World News, the Federalist, and dozens of other leading media outlets. He is also president of SmartSolve, an award-winning startup business focused on sustainable packaging. Jonathan played football and received an undergraduate degree from Bowling Green State University and master's degree in public policy from Georgetown University. Jonathan is the founder of Champions in Action, chairman of the Forge Leadership Network Board of Directors, and executive chairman of the Wood County Republican Party. Jonathan, his wife Missy, and his 4 children reside in Northwest Ohio. Quite the resume, huh?
Yeah, I'm humbled. There's a lot of things in my life that I would not have predicted, George. If you and I had sat down 20 years ago, I definitely could have predicted the trajectory of my life. But there's a scripture passage that is an anchor for me. It says, though a man plans his way in his heart, the Lord establishes his steps. That's Proverbs, I think Proverbs 16. So I think that's really the recounting of the story. By his grace, I've seen many things that have blessed me, and certainly have had valleys and challenges, but that's part of life.
20 years ago, the young Jonathan, who has just finished with the high school sports and everything, how the transition to politics happened? Did you always have been interested, or it was just a stage of your life when you decided to be more interested on the society as well, not only on yourself and your family and friends, so to speak?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. I'm sure it's similar to your story, George, amongst others. As you get older, the things that are most important become more important. When you're younger, life is just kind of focused on you and your own interests and passions. But as you get older and have kids especially, it changes the worldview and perspective of how you view things that surround you. For me, the political awakening, I write about it in Bellwether Blues. It really occurred when I was at Georgetown in my master's program. I had learned evangelism. I was a missionary in Guatemala. I launched a nonprofit in Guatemala, had done work with multiple people all throughout the world, convincing them on the truth claims of the gospel, on how salvation in Christ and Christ alone would transform them and bring them to life, and that was the truth. And I had many debates with many people throughout the world. So I had a really good understanding of how to articulate and defend my faith. But when I went to Georgetown, this was in 2008, I had many colleagues, and much to their credit, they weren't arrogant. They weren't horrible people at all. They were very kind people, but they were very persuasive in their apologetics of why the democratic worldview, the liberal worldview, was the one that was best for a future society. And even though I grew up in a household, I say I hit the jackpot. My parents taught us the Bible and really taught us hard work and the core values of the American dream. So they voted Republican, and I just naturally did, but I didn't know why. I just kind of went with what my parents voted for.
Yeah, it runs in the family.
Yeah, that's right. It was in the family. So in graduate school, when we were having these discussions, I recognized that I didn't have a why for my political perspective, and it changed me. It made me much more libertarian, and it created a curiosity in me to begin investigating what the history was of our nation, what the foundations were of truth, and what I ought to believe should have a why behind it. My convictions should have a foundation that is tied to the things that are good, beautiful, and true. And that journey really led to my conservative awakening, which is the subtitle of my book, Conservative Awakening of the Millennial Soul, and which gave me a conviction and a passion for why.
It sounds like you knew what you're thinking, but you didn't know why you're thinking it.
Yes. Well stated, my friend. Well stated.
So why are you a conservative, Mr. Jakubowski?
Well, I'm not sure, George. Have you heard of this concept of the golden triangle of freedom?
Can't recall immediately.
Yeah, it's one of the things that's kind of a hidden gem. You know, when you go back to the writings of the founders that are influential, specifically to me, it's the founders of our nation here in America, which ended up launching the most successful experiment in human history. Wherefore, too, every nation had a GDP that was, roughly speaking, on average, $2 per day per person. All of a sudden, you had this explosion of economic success. And there was a guy named Alexis de Tocqueville from France who was asking this question in 1831. How on earth did America, this upstart nation from nowhere, have so much success so quickly? Why do we see this miracle of economic development occurring? And his thesis, I think, is a really important one to investigate in the book Democracy in America. He looks at all the societies and kind of boils his thesis down to what I think the founders would have called the golden triangle of freedom, or at least the elements of the golden triangle of freedom. And the first element of the golden triangle of freedom is freedom. America, if you think of America, what is the word that most represents it, most embodies it? I think what comes to mind is the word freedom. It's in our anthems, it's in our speeches.
Land of the free.
Statue of Liberty, land of the free, home of the brave, right?
Yeah.
But to have freedom, you have to have a society that's also virtuous. A society that's virtuous is going to be built off of the family. The foremost institution at cultivating virtue is a mother and father in the home with their children, helping raise them up to be the person that they were created by God to be. So virtue is necessary, because the moment that you take away virtue and you have a society of vagrants, a society of people that perpetuate violence, a society of thieves and robbers, it looks a lot like the Soviet Union and the implementation of the heavy hand of communism. You have to increase the size of the state and thereby decrease the expression of freedom, because you don't have a virtuous people. So freedom requires virtue, and then virtue, to be a virtuous person, as we know, we can't do this alone. My righteousness is like filthy rags. Virtue requires faith, and faith informs us of virtue because we have a source of strength inside of us, the Spirit of God that works within us to cultivate the fruits of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. It's Galatians 5. So faith gives us the foundation and the strength to be able to live a life of virtue, a life that empowers future generations, that lives selflessly, that helps us have a perspective that's not so focused on self. And faith informs that. However, faith requires freedom. So that's the whole golden triangle. Yep. Without freedom, think of North Korea, think of the Soviet Union, think of China. When you don't have freedom, you quelch the free expression of these inalienable rights and virtues and the fruits of the Spirit that would otherwise be spread throughout the land. So what made me a conservative was recognizing that government is informative of things that matter. The law is one of our greatest moral teachers, according to Aristotle. And when it is at its best, it's going to advance those eternal truths.
What you're saying is very interesting, because now, talking to you and listening to you, I start to realize that actually the only regimes, the only places in the world where there is the society is not free are also the ones who have a complete absence of faith, whether it was the communism in the 20th century, or whether it's North Korea today, or Cuba, or countries like this. The lack of freedom is tightly connected with the lack of faith.
Yeah.
So basically,
right.
a virtuous man cannot be deprived of his freedom.
Well, as you know, George, the greatest threat to a totalitarian state is a higher authority. And as we know from the dictates of many faith worldviews, not only the Christian faith, but certainly the Christian faith, is that there is no supreme being greater than God himself. God is the ultimate source of authority. And it's why the Declaration of Independence in America is, I think, the most important document in our history, because it set forth the vision. It created the Northern Star for the trajectory of our nation and where we would head. And it submitted to those inalienable rights. It submitted governing authorities. The consent of the governed fell underneath the God-given inalienable rights that could only come from God and not from anyone else.
Many of our contemporary philosophers, people like you, people who talk a lot about virtues, who are conservatives, who are writing books, who are trying to spread the word, are constantly clashing with this aggressive. It's not a war. It should be a war if it was static, but it's not. It's constantly attacking us. So they're all the time they are fighting with this aggressive wave of atheism, and some of them have accepted this mild formula, talking about virtues, saying that you might not believe in God, or you might not believe that God exists, but living as He does is not a bad idea. It will make you a better man. What do you think about that?
Well, I think it's, I go back to Richard Dawkins, one of the famous atheists who said, man, I wish we could have the virtues that a Judeo-Christian Western civilization.
He finally came to that, yeah, he finally came to that. After years and years of talking strange stuff, say it this way, let's be polite. After years and years of talking strange stuff, he finally came to that.
Yeah, he did, but he has the wrong formula. You can't have that. You can't have the fruit from a tree that bears poison in its roots. The roots have to go into the rich soils of truth that come from a source that is eternal and absolute. And we live in a society where postmodern relativism has been the poisonous fruit from that barren tree. And it's largely shifted the worldview from one where in the 16th century, nearly everyone believed in God. They might not believe in the same God, or they might have a different perspective on who God was, but they submitted themselves to the reality that they were not the center of the universe, that truth would have to come from an external source. And that level of humility and that predisposition affected the way that they viewed the world and affected the way they view society. Today, everything has changed. Today, the center of the universe are the very individuals themselves who can in 2 days have everything in the world shipped to their doorstep via Amazon and live better than a king of the 17th, 18th, or even the 19th centuries.
Yep.
So it makes us believe, it gives us this fake conviction that we are our own gods, that we can define reality. If I'm a man born in a woman's body, well, then I can be whatever I want to be. I can call myself a man. If I'm a woman born in a man's body, I can be whatever I want to be, right? And that is a reflection of the shift that has occurred in worldview, and it wages war not only on the individual human soul, it wages war on the governing philosophy and the environment in which we operate, which creates the conflict that you're referring to.
But the conflict, I believe, the tides has turned, and after a certain point, after a certain peak of idiocracy, it started to work once again for us, for common sense, for faith, for virtues, for things that have been established since humankind exists, the natural order of things. Because 20 years ago, if they, who I'm referring to as they, if they say for someone like you that you're stuck in the medieval times, that you're old-fashioned and everything, people would kind of hear. It was kind of acceptable and modern idea that we are stuck in the medieval ages, and we are some clerics, and we are out of the today's civil society. But 10 years after, when they started to explain us that men can get pregnant, people said, oh, it's too much. No, we should go back. This is too much. I believe it's working in our favor now. I don't know how it looks from your perspective, because actually you're in the middle of it.
Yeah, you're right. I think in some places it's a little more exaggerated than others. And the universities, the institutions of education and higher learning are one of the primary institutions to blame for the postmodern muck in which we live, where the theories that they sought to see lived out have largely failed because they're in defiance of the truth. I think Aristotle was the one who says that, I mentioned him earlier about the law being your greatest moral teacher, but he also says education informs the law. Education is necessary to create moral givers who have a rational basis and understanding of truth. And I think that that's part of the major issue is people will have, and we're talking about, I think, general society. So Joe Schmo is maybe a term we use here, or Mr. Smith, whatever you want to use, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, as they see these policies lived out, whether through local, state, or federal governments, or through specific institutions, and they see the lunacy that follows. And then the consequences, the negative externalities that occur, where you start having, for example, males claiming to be females playing in female sports. And the results of that, that's cataclysmic. And it really it shifts their philosophy to recognize that you can't deviate yourself from the absolute source of truth. There is an absolute truth source, and you can identify it when we move away from it and we move towards the opinions of mere man, and whatever we define to be as true, then no longer does right make might. Might makes right.
Sure. You're absolutely right. And I also think that regarding to what you mentioned about the men and women sports, I think we also reached the peak idiocracy there, and it started to get back, and it started to blow in the faces of people who invented it, because even the United Nations 2 days ago posted a report calling for saving the women's sports from men, saying that 900 biological women were robbed from their medals from biological men, which is basically a crime. Can you imagine some girl that has trained all her life, spending hours and hours every day, working hard, and suddenly some guy, 2 meters tall and 300 pounds comes and takes the title, and she's just sitting there humiliated, I cannot even imagine how it feels, and I never want to know. But actually it starts to turn back. But you mentioned education. We'll talk about Forge a little later, because this is actually that you keep on doing, and you get all my compliments for this, that you find the time and the power and the energy to do that as your mission. But is it a matter of education? Because you also have a master's degree from an elite university, but I don't think that today, when you go to an elite university and you meet an extremely well-educated student from an extremely well-educated family, who is supposed to be your next leader of your country, and you ask him, what is a woman? I don't think you get an answer. Is it up to education? I believe the person knows very well what a woman is, but he's never going to tell you. Why?
Yeah. Yep, it's an excellent point, George. I agree with you. It's not education the way a postmodern society has defined it. You can't untether education from truth. When you untether education from truth, the whole thing falls apart. So education properly understood is that with a foundational worldview that advances the absolute truth claims that made Western civilization what it became, right? And that's the Judeo-Christian, specifically Judeo-Christian truth claims that help to build out the framework of the natural law. And this is why I think homeschooling is such a significantly advancing movement in America. I'm not sure in Bulgaria. I'd love to hear your thoughts on whether or not homeschooling has become
there is some for sure. Yeah.
We see it as a very positive move, because God gave to parents the ability to educate their children. If not, he wouldn't have gifted us with children. Granted, I fail in many occasions, but generally speaking, my aim is to educate my child to be the person who they are called to be. And there's a lot of lessons in life that they need. And for some reason, going back to, Jean-Jacques Rousseau and this belief that the state ought to be the ultimate nanny teaching lessons to the children, the state can never replace the institution that God created with the responsibility of raising and bearing children and having them walk in the ways of the Lord. That's the greatest and most important source of education, is it starts inside of the home with the family.
Absolutely. It's family first. Family is the first cell of the society, of course.
Yeah. So that said, I do believe education is a part of it, but not education the way the world describes it, defines it, and understands it. It's education properly understood, established with those foundations, completely tethered and built on the foundation of truth.
It's not a matter of education. What is stopping them from telling basic truths? Is it the fear of getting rejected? Is it the liberal bubble? Is it the case that we talked about even with you when we were in Hungary, when this guy is asking these girls how many genders there are, and one of them says, I think 2, and the other one says, don't say this on camera, shut up, don't say it on camera. So she doesn't say it's there are not 2, or you're lying, or it's not like that, or it's not true. She only told her, don't say this on camera. So why is that? Because I took some courses in Harvard Medical School, and the professors that were teaching me are extremely well educated. Those are maybe the most educated people in the world. I'm sure they're very well aware that woman is a human organism with excess chromosomes, with uterus and with organs, and a body that can give birth to a child. It's so simple to be described, So why is it? Why is this phenomenon where Matt Walsh was literally walking around the U.S. and asking people what is a woman, and he didn't get a straight answer for hours, everyone was like, well, no, I don't know. No, I don't.
Yeah.
Why is that? Is it fear? Fear of getting rejected? Fear of the liberal bubble? Fear of what is this?
Yeah, I mean, my response, I'm sure there's a lot of people that could speak to this, but generally speaking, people can deceive themselves to the highest degree, to the point where they believe the things that they've studied, or believe the things that they want to believe. And it goes back to their perspective on who is God. If I am God, then that which I state as truth becomes truth. And I can believe that as hard as I want, regardless of what realities may surround me. You know, however, that nobody can live life in contradiction to absolute truth for a long period of time without recognizing the consequences that come with that worldview. So I think there are many people who have succumbed to peer pressure, and who in front of the camera are publicly are going to state that which is expected of them to state, to go along to get along, to advance in the institutions of this world that award people for staying in the lanes that they're supposed to stay in. But I think there's also a pretty significant mass of people that actually do believe the things that they promulgate. They believe it to the core of their soul, but only for a season of life. We're only looking at them from a window of life. And it goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden, from the very beginnings of earth, when Satan himself in the form of a snake asked Eve if she wanted to have the knowledge of God. Well, it's not necessarily the fact that we need to identify the truth. It's that we have to rightly identify what is almost truth. When we can identify what is almost truth, we're able to see the little bit of the deceit, the little wedge that finds its way into our heart, that is the first step toward living an entire life of deceitfulness. And this, throughout human history, is something we've seen, which has been the cause and detriment to the loss of the lives of entire masses of people. I mean, genocide being committed on the basis of one racial group feeling that they are feeling superior to another is also a lie that has been fully believed by these leaders, and then that lie has been expanded and then acted upon because the leaders have taught this lie and forced the people to succumb to it.
So it's just purely ideological and a matter of just political positioning, where a man sees himself, somehow convinces him to say the things that are right for his community and not generally relating to truth.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's that, and I think it's also people that they drink the Kool-Aid, right? That they begin to believe and espouse and declare those things that become truths to them, lowercase t truths. Actually, have you ever read Francis Bacon at all?
Yep.
So, the Baconian philosophy was the major shift from kind of the classical philosophers to the modern and then postmodern philosophers. And Bacon's idea was the only way that we can solve these disputes, which we've been unable to and will never, ever be able to resolve between the Platonian theorists and the Aristotelian theorists. His perspective was we have to go to the individual bark of the tree. And if we can get all the way down to the core level, the root of the DNA of the bark of the tree, then we can find truth and build it up from there. I think there's certainly truth to that. I think there's a lot that he created in the advancements of science. But the fundamental flaw, the almost truth, if I would, going back to that analogy earlier of the wedge that I think can change us, that almost truth was now we're moving truth and fact-finding down to the micro level and abandoning the macro level truths that must govern the universe. And when we abandon those and we go to the tree and we go to the bark inside of a tree and we make the bark of that tree define our reality, well, what if we found a tree that has an abnormality and that bark has a sickness or a disease or a malfunction? And we're going to use that specific bark where we've identified that abnormality to define the rest of the forest? That's the wrong way to go about it. We're submitting the universal truths to the particular facts that we find in a specific subset of trees. And I do believe that there are people that have lived their whole lives just looking at the bark of that tree, sticking with that analogy, that they've caught themselves inside of that and are unable to extract themselves from a position to see the general truths that govern the universe. And I think the leaders have not only created the system of education for that, the leaders who actually do know the absolute truths disregard it because they want the power and they want the masses to follow them, so they use those facts as a way of doing that.
Yep. Referring to your book and to the American history in general, the Constitution, the Founding Fathers, the creation of this amazing society and this amazing economy, what are the universal truths for you today, and which one of them are most challenged by our political, I don't like the word enemies, but let's say competitors?
Sure. Well, the document that I referred to earlier, the Declaration of Independence, is that Northern Star. So we should look to it if we want to understand what are some of those pillars, the core pillars that advance the truths that our founders believed were significant and important for the success of our nation. And there's one paragraph that's often quoted, well known by many Americans, and it says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed." And it goes on to state many, Jefferson waxes eloquent along with that congressional entity that drafted that. But I think that those core truths right there, that there is a creator, the recognition that there is a creator, and that no governing authority, no matter how smart it may seem, how much money is thrown at a problem, how many degrees that they have, no governing entity is ever going to be able to object to or overcome the eternal truths that are established upon the Judeo-Christian foundation. That is axiomatic. And if our nation is void of that, and this goes back to the golden triangle of freedom, then we're going to deviate from the pillars that made America America. So that's the first thing. And then it gets into inalienable rights, because the founders recognized man for who he was in his human nature. He is both equally worthy of inalienable rights because he was created by God, but at the same time equally predisposed to tremendous sin and deceit, such that we had to create specific protections. And think about the Federalist Papers, where they talk about the protections that were enacted in our system, checks and balances, the separation of powers, the branches fighting against themselves, trying to protect interest against interest. That was because we understood the rightful nature of man. And we understood that men are not angels. So men, as not being angels, cannot properly govern themselves without the appropriate checks and balances.
No one deserves an absolute power, right?
No one deserves absolute power. And the limitations of those powers are necessary in order to ensure that these people of these inalienable rights, the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, they ought to have that access because they are God created. The founders also recognized that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, while everyone has an equal right to life, an equal right to liberty, and an equal right to pursuit of happiness, human beings are different. Some have more talents than others. So that we build a system of meritocracy instead of one that was built on nepotism or oligarchism or some other form of government. We wanted to build one that was based upon the merits of the individual rising to the top, and those that rose to the top would be the ones that would be the rightful place as ruling us, because they would have advanced these truths. So I think as we look at the plague of the most recent critical theorists and their idea of making equitable outcomes, they're eliminating this recognition that if you don't have a system of meritocracy that rewards those that successfully advance in society, the rightful aims of society, that society will fall within itself. So those are a few things that I would point out to that question. And I go back to as well the golden triangle of freedom, because I think those three things advanced are the three most successful things that will allow America to continue to be America.
You mentioned that at least years ago you were very libertarian in your views. I consider myself as well on the economical part, but free market also has its challenges. Two cases from the USA that I really want to hear you talking about, and what the decision is. First, there was this website Gawker many years ago. They were part of a tech platform. They're basically owned by a website who is publishing tech news, and somewhere along the way they stepped on Peter Thiel's foot with something, and he remembered that. Years after, Gawker published some stuff about Hulk Hogan, of all people. He decides to sue them, and Peter Thiel finds out and says, "Oh, now I gotcha." So he sends the cavalry, sends the best advocates ever, makes the case in Florida, because there the laws are, let's say, very good for such cases, for Hulk Hogan, of course. He wins the case, and he basically bankrupts the website and the whole company and closes it down. No laws are violated. This is by court decision. But here we have a case of a very rich guy, and I like Peter Thiel, who was just sitting and waiting and waiting and waiting, and finally says, "Gotcha," with his millions. So no laws are violated, free market. how do you feel about cases like this? What is this, just a natural order, or the little one gets eaten by the big one, or what is this?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there are definitely challenges in our judicial system to reflect or to protect equal access to justice. And I think the best thing we can do is strip away the precedent, strip away all of the judicial review and the outcomes that have occurred over the last 250 years of the American jurisprudence, system of American jurisprudence, and go back to the foundations of what is a just and equal society. What does it mean like for someone to have access to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? And to understand that properly, I think we look to the Word of God. Our society was built upon Judeo-Christian values, and among those Judeo-Christian values was the understanding that neither the rich man nor the poor man should have a balance on the scales. They both should have equal access to justice, and it was the duty of the judge and the jury, if the jury didn't necessarily exist fully in Bible times, but it was the job of those making the judicial decisions to not weigh the scales in either side, but to look at it with a blindfold and apply the law in a manner that treats them as they ought to be treated, which are children of God who have made a mistake out of bounds, out of the line of the law that sets what is true north, what is up and what is down. And because of all of the additional things that we've added to our system, it's become askew, because there's countless cases we could go through and talk about how that system seems to have created an imbalance either way.
It's difficult to fight them when the money gets too big, right?
Yeah, I think so money is power, right? Money, the more you have in monetary wealth, and there's multiple examples of this out there. It's, the children of the wealthy and the wealthy who have advanced theories that create laws. Usually they have, think of Hunter Biden. Hunter Biden has got to be one of the most privileged individuals in all of the world, because his dad is the president, was the vice president, and all of that power created a shield around him to break laws that other people who don't have that same privilege and protection have had to be subjugated to. That is a demonstration of a lack of justice. So when you weaponize justice on the basis of a political worldview, which is what is happening here, Steve Bannon, who you're going to be hearing in a little bit, we'll talk about this, I think, in New York quite extensively. The moment that we tip the scales of justice away from a blindfolded view on the rational basis of the law and whether or not it was violated, is the moment we move into a system that is going to be based upon the power, the persuasion, the influence of those that manage the system.
This is when the jury, the court, of course, and when it's a problem of legislation and the judicial system, which sometimes is not the case. One more case for you. I completely get your point, and of course, equal justice, no matter how rich you are, is extremely important for creating a sustainable democracy and a just society, of course. One more case. Late Shadow Adamson, the gambling mogul from Las Vegas, there were a very few independent media in the whole area there, and suddenly there was only one left, which was criticizing some flaws and problems in his organization, which are, I would say, normal. Any huge organization has done something here and there for which journalists can write about. And of course, they were declared an enemy of the state, so to speak. They were under total advertising embargo, and they were looking for financing. But they knew that Mr. Adolphson is waiting for them. And suddenly this offer comes, and they check the company, and they check it for months. Those are investigative journalists. And finally they accept the offer because they checked for months and investigated whether it has something to do with Mr. Adolphson. The deal is signed, they accept the offer, they signed the deal because they needed the financing. On the next day, Mr. Adolphson's people came to the office and say, "Gotcha. It was us. Hello. Effective today, you're either censored or fired." So, no laws are violated. It's not even a matter of justice. It's just free market. So, I don't know. Of course, everyone is looking for his own interest. The interest of Mr. Adolphson and his organization is to make money for their shareholders. Legit, all right. So I really didn't know for myself what should I learn from this story, you know?
Sure. Well, I would say, one, there's no system of human government that will ever be perfect until the King of Kings returns, right? Until the Lord has his reign.
Sure.
So I think the question that we have to ask ourselves is, are these cases the exception or are they the rule? And if they are the rule, then it points to a system of influence amongst an oligarchic class of leaders, of favored leaders, who have the ability to tip the scales of balance in their favor. And it speaks to a lack of a check and balance that's necessary in our judicial processes to ensure that the systems of justice do indeed prevail on defending the rights of all individual citizens. I think that one of the biggest issues that we face is over 51% of our GDP is now represented by our government. So our government now has more power than it's ever had, and a nation of $20 trillion, if that's what I think the GDP is today, 51% of that is tied to the government. The government has undue influence, and the decisions in the private sector that determine whether or not a livable wage is going to be earned by the citizens themselves. So do we have problems to solve with influence being made in favor of the privileged elites? Absolutely. There's no question about that. Is that a check or a critique of a free market society, that the free market is the cause of that? I don't think so. I do think that the free market system itself in principle is going to have flaws, and those flaws have been demonstrated. There will be seasons where there's going to be levels of inequities. There will be differences in when one can benefit and when one doesn't benefit. But by and large, the free society, the free economy, has given and liberated from poverty the masses that only centuries ago were subjugated to living a life that was much more dependent upon an oligarchic or monarchical or
absolutely.
Totalitarian society.
Absolutely. Beautifully said, because look, those cases are just a reason to think about the system. It's not criticizing the system in general, because after all, you guys have built the greatest economy in the world. So it's one thing to look for flaws in the best thing ever created as a national economy, and it's completely another thing to talk about some country in the third world or from China, because obviously you are a free society, because if you are not, I will never knew these stories, right?
That's right.
I don't know a single story about media freedom in China, if you get what I'm saying. And probably I never will.
That's the exception. The exception in China is freedom. The rule is totalitarian implementation of a heavy hand. And you make a great point in that it doesn't mean, however, even though we're the greatest economy and we've had the freest society, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't look upon these examples and just kind of look at them with a scoff. I do think that there are fair critiques to any system that is trying to create a society that has justice. I think of the critical theorists that are out there, and they're able to use arguments that really pull on the heartstrings of people, because they talk about how society in the way that it's been established has favored only the wealthy. And it's caused those that are poor to say, yeah, I see that. I look at the data, I see income inequality, and that to me is the metric of all things. So it's not that we shouldn't look at these things and try to improve. In fact, we ought to improve. But I think the aim is to have a rising tide that floats all boats. The critical theorists want to take it all down. They want to burn the whole system down, and they have nothing to replace it with. So that's the issue, is you have manipulative leaders that want totalitarian authority. They want to reenact the Soviet Union in America. They want to have re-education camps for their wicked ideology, but they do have truthful points or factual evidence that they can use to demonstrate how a free market society does have people that are on the outside looking in. And some of those people are in my backyard in Ohio. J.D. Vance, I think, he's a vice presidential candidate, gives an incredible voice to those in our society that have largely been left out. They've been left behind. The globalization and the offshoring of jobs has created a major issue amongst those that have been replaced. And I think those kinds of critiques, if we can navigate that rightfully and recognize those populations, it doesn't mean that recognizing that there are flaws that we should throw the whole system out. It does mean that we should probably make adjustments to make it better. You
should improve it, not kill it, because actually they killed it in Russia a century ago, and we all saw what happened. So
that's right.
Killing it is not a good idea, but improving it is important. So the voices of the critics are also important, because they create they create tensions in the society, and this put pressures on the politicians, and finally, somewhere along the line, those flaws are fixed by the laws or whoever is responsible for them, for your three branches of power. So it's important to do that. But I don't have problem with inequality. Do you have one? Because today's communists and socialists, and in USA you call them Democrats, which is funny, you know. But today's communists and socialists, I believe, are really jumping on inequality as a problem. For me, it's not. Why? When does the inequality started? 2 centuries ago, we were all equally poor all around the earth. There were 10 monarchs who had some money, which are basically nothing compared to the rich people today, and everyone else was poor. You had a small house, a shed, a cow, a horse, and that's it. And then the Industrial Revolution came, and the person who, up until yesterday, made 1 hat a day, he had some money aside, and he bought a machine. And suddenly the machine produces 1,000 hats a day. And on the next day, the guy is earning 1,000 times more than the person next to him who was helping him make the hats. So there is an inequality, huge inequality, 1,000 times more. But why is that a problem? He bought the machine and now he's able to make 1,000 hats and sell them. So let him spend his money. Let him send his kids to college or whatever. It's his money. He earned them. Why is inequality a problem? Is it? Is it a problem?
Yeah. Well, you're making points that I agree with. Absolutely, generally speaking, in the camp that usually income inequality is used as a cudgel. It's a political cudgel to enact a worldview that will create equality. But the only equality it will create is equality in poverty. And it will empower a very small level of elite who have all of the wealth of society. And that story has been told far too many times for us to have to say that that's only a hypothesis or a theory.
Oh, trust me, we lived it. Trust me, we lived it. Yeah, 35 years ago. 35 years ago, everyone was equally poor. Maybe a small panel apartment. I hope you never know what this is. An apartment in a panel building where you hear the wind blowing through the walls. Maybe some small Soviet car, maybe a TV, you know, and that's it. Pretty much that's it. Everyone was equally poor. That was the outcome of the system, of the dream.
That's right. That's right.
We were all equal, but we were equally poor.
That's exactly what will happen when income inequality becomes a cudgel for a specific worldview. The question you asked, however, is it something that we should look at or does it matter? And I think it's something that we should take into consideration. I don't think it's something that should form our broader policy mandates, but it's something to be aware of, because it's one thing for income inequality to be so high that the average person at the bottom is making, let's say, $100,000 a year, and the top is at multiple billions. And at the heart of that is envy or jealousy, and that person with $100,000, even though they have more than enough to live and more than most of the people throughout human history, all they can see is the rising billionaire, and that makes them jealous, and they want to pull them down, just like the lobster effect. I think that's one ditch of income inequality, and that's what drives a lot of the embrace of socialism amongst rising generations. Is envy is a major part of when you detach yourself from the worldview where your life is defined by God. Now you're defining your own life. You start to look at others and say, "Why I should be like them." So you want a system of power that holds guns to people's heads and extracts the resources and gives them to you. That's one ditch. But then there's another ditch where you actually have situations where the society, largely speaking, there are down and outs who, because of poor policies that have been made, because of elites benefiting from the system, you have the downcast and downtrodden who do not have a true opportunity to step into an economic opportunity that will give them the vitality to be able to advance their family. Or they have to wait a whole generation. And I think that's where it's important to watch and pay attention to, especially the downcast, the downtrodden of society. In fact, Guatemala, I mentioned earlier, I founded a nonprofit in Guatemala. It has one of the highest Gini coefficients in the world. The Gini coefficient measures income inequality. And I look at the masses of children that we work with. We work with several thousand kids plus. And I look at their lives versus the life of the wealthy of Guatemalan society. And you ask what the differences are. And it does come down to, in many ways, the family dynamics and the system of law that surrounds the wealthy and the important in society. And these individuals are downcast and downtrodden. So that doesn't mean that it needs to be the factor that determines a specific political ideology, but I do think it's important to know who in society is left out, and then what are things that we can do to help empower them, to help them fulfill their God-given purpose. And that's where I think we get out of the realm of the state and we start getting into charitable efforts of the church, private sector efforts of companies. We start to see economies develop. And there's a lot of answers we could talk about, but that's my thoughts on income inequality.
Yeah, but you live in Ohio and you travel a lot. So from all the amazing perspective that you, as you said, are lucky to have with your the way your life has developed, and all the experiences and the points of view that you have met through your travelings around the world, do you believe that in the USA, inside the USA, the equal opportunities and the equal start is still possible? Is it a fact? Because people say, oh, no one's stopping you from becoming the next Bezos. Well, I don't know. If you're born in the projects in a one-parent family and you live on food stamps and social payments all of your childhood, and your friends and your surroundings is, you know, the ghetto and the crime and the street crime, and everyone is selling drugs around you, and so yeah, no one is stopping you from becoming the next Bezos, but I don't think it's quite possible.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I have had the blessing and privilege of traveling. I would say it's more so in America than any other country I've visited that someone could rise from the ash heap of poverty with everything against them and become a massive success.
Great answer. Great answer.
So
yeah.
I do think that there are sometimes more obstacles than there ought to be. And like we just talked about earlier with income inequality, I think we should pay attention to those things. Like I said, J.D. Vance is doing a great job. Donald Trump, they've given a voice to the down and out classes who are deemed the deplorables by Hillary Clinton.
Yeah.
They recognize that class and they seek to give voice to it. But that point aside, I think every American should have a missions trip to some destination globally. Because when I look at the kids that we serve in Guatemala, or the kids I've met in Ethiopia, Rwanda, Kenya, or Thailand, or any other place for that matter in those parts, I look at the probabilities that they have against them to overcome the obstacles, and they seem far more difficult. The obstacles far greater. The challenge is far more significant because of a lack of justice. Whereas in America, there is still an opportunity to rise from that. There's more resources that surround them, more opportunities for mobility, to be able to find a different place to live, where you can navigate change the obstacles that are in your way.
Yep. So obviously you're extremely well educated. You've read your books, you've read your history, you read your religion and everything. So when do you felt the urge to teach, to preach, to spread the word, and how did Forge actually happened? And then you become the chairman of the board. What is Forge? From your perspective of, obviously you got this, the need to teach and to tell to the next generation and to form the next leaders.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question, George. Thank you. I think the answer of when should we teach, it's pretty quick in life. As I follow the example of Jesus, the last commandment that he leaves us is to go into the world and to make disciples. That's not a passive statement. That is a command. Making disciples involves teaching. A disciple is someone that closely follows you and follows your ways. The problem is we have too many teachers without their own teachers. We have too many people that want to teach and want to speak, and they don't have someone that they're following. They don't have mentors. They don't have leaders that disciple them. So the rightful alignment of teacher, just using the framework of discipleship from the Bible, is you have someone that's discipling you, somebody that's your colleague or friend that's sharpening your iron, so a brother that is able to hold you accountable to make sure that you're walking the way of truth, and then somebody that you're discipling. And from the moment that I'm training my son, in fact, my son's now 12 years old, and I'm training him how to disciple one of his friends. He needs to start at a young age. As soon as the Word of God has come alive in him, then he is emitting spiritual light. And that is the light that must shine in the darkness, and the darkness cannot comprehend it. And there are so many examples of people that need that discipleship that we have to start at a younger and younger age, so that the future generations can have more momentum earlier than we had when we were being raised up. So I know that doesn't answer your Forge question, but I wanted to at least speak to when should we start teaching. when should we start sharing the truth? I think it starts as soon as we know what the truth is.
Yeah, that was the first part of the question. Now let's go to Forge. Tell us about Forge.
Okay, not a Forge. And this is exactly what Forge does. So I am honored to be the chairman of the board. The co-founders, Adam Josephic and Justin Powell, started Forge in 2016 when they saw a major gap existing in the conservative movement in America. I'm not sure, George, if you or your listeners would be familiar with the way that Major League Baseball works, but we have major league teams like the Yankees, and then there's a farm system, a AAA team, a AA team, a single A team. And those teams, and if I'm not mistaken, the Yankees team, the AAA team is Columbus, the Columbus Clippers. So that analogy fits really well for Forge because we're originally based out of Ohio. Now we've expanded. But we saw that all of the conservative talent that was around us, it would go to the major leagues. It would fly to Washington, D.C., to the swamp, and there our leadership class would exist.
We have this in Europe. Let me tell you, it's just an A team, a B team, and a C team. You know, the best one play the A team, and then you have the B team with the youngsters and the people who are training. But yeah, the ultimate goal is to go to the A team, of course, and play on the big stadium. Sure. I got you.
So we saw the issue was that all of the talent, all of it, 100% of it there was no C team, there was no B team, there was only an A team, and all of the talent would go to the A team. Meanwhile, we had a deficiency of talent, a deficiency of knowledge, a deficiency of accountability, a deficiency of courage in our state capitals in Columbus, Ohio. And because of that deficiency, we had lawmakers the good ones were isolated and unable to stand for themselves and stand for truths that were necessary to create transformation. So Forge was created largely out of the vision of raising the next generation of young conservative leaders, 18 to 24, to fill that pipeline, to create leaders at that C level and B level, so that as they mature, then they can rise to the A level with people following behind them who they're training and rising up. And it has been largely successful as we now have over 700 graduates that have gone through our program. We have a 101, a 201, and a 301. 101 is largely domestic policy. It's in the state capitals, Nashville, Tennessee, and Columbus, Ohio. The students come to a summit, and for a week, they're engaged in legislative simulation. They hear from the best conservative speakers. They learn about worldview. They read books. And we, as our leadership team, measures their success and their efficiency. And out of the entire class, we choose 50% of them that advance to 201, and they become what are called Forge Fellows. And 201 now goes from purely kind of domestic policy at the state level to now the federal level domestic policy, where they're meeting with the think tanks that are part of the national movement in Washington, D.C. They get a picture of the A League, to use your analogy.
Yeah.
And then 301 is an international trip. Now, it used to be Israel until the war broke out, but they would go to Israel for 11 days and understand more about international policy. So Forge uses that programming to fortify not just an understanding, a depth of understanding amongst these fellows as to the worldview that they should be attuned to as they seek to advance truth, but also, and almost probably more importantly, it gives them other fellow fellows who they can walk the journey with so that they're not alone.
Yeah, building the network.
That's right.
How are you financing yourself? Is it possible to do significant stuff in U.S. politics without some significant financing? Because the way we see things, and people starting to raise money, basically congressmen from the day they are elected, they started to raise money for the next elections. And this poor guy from the Democrats who supported the Trump tax reform, and the journalists just jump on him in the halls of the Congress, and they said, "Why did you vote for the Trump?" He said, "Because my donors told me that if I do not support this on the next day, I should erase their phones. They are never going to answer me anymore." So he was very clear, and very honest. It was kind of sympathetic. But is it possible to do significant things to leave a trace in politics without significant financing? And how are you able to support such a big organization?
Yeah, so Forge started out bootstrapping itself, right? We had to raise $50,000 in the first year to pull off the summit, and then we had to pay our president. So we've had many years where the balance sheet of the organization gives us heartburn. But we've also, through that process and journey, have been able to see the miraculous hand of God, where a financial gift would come in at a moment that we didn't anticipate, and it would allow us to move to the next level. Forge is privately financed. It's done by charitable donors. which include foundations. We, in fact, were one of the first entities to win a Heritage Foundation Innovation Prize. That happened a couple of years ago. That was a big deal, as they were trying to find the most important organizations in the country that were advancing timeless truths, and Forge was one of those organizations they rewarded. But that said, we're at a disadvantage relative to the amount of money that the George Soros-like entities have.
Yep.
The entities that these founders on the left are creating are not about developing and cultivating the souls of the human beings that they work with. That's what we're about. No. They're about temporary political outcomes that create a political gain for their very dangerous and destructive worldview. So we do have, if you look at that, we're relatively speaking far underfunded. But the beautiful part of when you create a whole human soul, when you help cultivate that, is the impact that they can have can be a force multiplier that transcends the monetary investment. I mean, how do you measure the value of a human soul? It's immeasurable. So trying to find a way to create the most bang for our buck, is a saying that we use, is really crucial at the size of our nonprofit. Now, I say that, George, but I also say, if we can find an organization that can come in and give us our next million, it would certainly help us expand our programming to reach more conservatives all throughout the nation.
Sure, yeah, it's always mostly welcome. But that was my question. But how do you? What's your stance on money and politics? They look too tight. Here we have a system where actually you have a state subsidy based on every vote. It's like $6 per vote. And actually, if your party is popular enough and you get enough votes, you get subsidized by the state to do your everyday party work, which is making you kind of independent from the rich folks, from the lobbyists, from the money guys, from the oligarchs. And you don't have that. And it's your system is individual, is based only on majority, and every guy has to fight for raising money for the next campaign from the day that he's elected. Is this becoming a problem? Because there's another point of view where actually big money lobbyists are telling politicians not to do anything stupid, which is obviously serving in the best interest of your corporations, because you have the biggest companies in the world from the US. The biggest technologies come from the US. You know, everything that we communicate for, the culture and everything, Hollywood is... You have created the most successful entities in each and every individual business. And maybe the big business holding politicians by the, let's say, ties, not the throats, and telling them not to do anything stupid is not such a bad idea. The outcome is not that bad, isn't it?
Well, it's an interesting question. And I think let me just go to what I think some of the problems are, what we talk about often in America is K Street. K Street is the street where you have all of the lobbyist buildings. And what has happened, to the point that you've kind of accentuated, is that big corporations, big business, has married big government. And those two are now cooperating in such a way that it's almost indistinguishable. What the lobbyists want versus what the politicians vote for versus what the businesses stand for. And this is why you have something like the human rights card, the HRC card, that was really dictating the actions of the corporations, because the corporations, what they did to receive their tax cuts, there's an article you could read by Russ Dutat, and I think it was in the New York Times in 2015, circa 2015 timeline, where he points to how there was a sacrifice of principle in exchange for tax cuts to make more money. The corporation said, okay, we're going to embrace the social side of what all of these movements are around the Obama administration. The GLAAD entities, GLAAD, so all the advancements of LGBTQ and all of these ESG metrics, we're going to embrace these in exchange for tax cuts. But in the process of that occurring, big business then became intricately tied in becoming a weapon in advancing those very things that were the enemy of the people. And because of that incestuous relationship on K Street between the big government regulators, the big business weaponized ESG and LGBTQ metrics with this HRC scorecard, you now start to get stories like that of Coca-Cola going against, protesting the decision of the state of Georgia, a law that creates, in fact, better election integrity. And they're criticizing that as something that is destructive. Or Walt Disney World going against the governor of the state of Florida, Governor DeSantis.
Yep.
So there's been a huge reform in the shaping of which these big companies, for a while, I think they held a seat of tremendous authority as agents of the government. Facebook, Instagram, Twitter being no surprise, right, during the 2020 election cycle, when they literally were being told by the FBI what they could and could not post, what they could and could not regulate. So these are all examples of these incestuous ties that occurred. But there was something that was recently broken 2 years ago, and it was the power of the people to boycott. They went to the source that was driving these corporations to make these decisions to capitulate on principles. So how do you fight them? Well, you go to their pocketbooks. And how did they do that? Well, it happened through the mass boycotts that occurred specifically with Bud Light. If you recall what happened with Bud Light when they brought forward that transgender
the trans
commercial.
Stuff,
Holy cow, did they pay for it? It was one of the, because there was a number of people that said boycotts will never work. But man, once they hit them in their wallets, what has boycott produced ever since? Nothing remotely close to that fashion. And there's an organization that one of the members of the board of my company, his name's Nathan Estruth, he founded the organization 1792 Exchange. And they create a scorecard that is the exact opposite of the HRC scorecard, which includes the ESG metrics and LGBTQ metrics. His scorecard on the 1792 Exchange scorecard talks about all the things that these corporations are doing on this side, so that business owners like myself, small business owners, small companies who are diabolically opposed to the diabolical things these organizations are doing, I should say diametrically opposed to the diabolical things these organizations are doing. This scorecard gives us access to see what these suppliers have been doing in the background. They're not telling it to us, but on Capitol Hill and at our state capitals, they're promoting all of these policies that we would stand against, that we wouldn't buy from them if we knew that these things were happening. So I know that this is kind of a long-winded response to the statement that was made as to big business's role in society and whether or not it's askew. I would argue it's mostly askew because big business has partnered with government, which is way too big. Big government, we are, like I mentioned, it's 51% of our GDP. We have a massive size of government, we have a massive size of business, and it's allowed this form of collusion to really become an enemy against the people.
Yeah, completely agree. Basically, there are instruments for this for this connection to be turned up. You know, you have the antitrust legislations and all of this. You just gotta have leaders with the political will to do it, because I think that even now you have the proper legislation and someone can tie up this stuff if he wants to. It's the only problem is to choose leaders that want to do that. 2 days ago we were talking with Brian Leip, former Republican congressional candidate from Florida, our friend. He's a pro-Israeli activist and he's a political PR. He's a CEO of a political PR company. And we noticed in the conversation that the subject that you are referring to kind of disappeared from the political campaign for these elections. You know, the LGBTQ stuff, the trans stuff, the green stuff, it totally disappeared. He says, yeah, that's a fact, and basically that's why the Democrats basically have no message. They're just saying that Trump is bad all day long. Their company has no focus, no message. But the disappearing of these issues, do you somehow feel that as a victory, or is something temporary because they just recognize that it's hurting them too much?
Well, it's a victory, but it's a temporary victory. That's not a permanent victory. I think the permanent victory is in the raising up of virtuous citizens who understand what is good, beautiful, and true, in a system that reforms education so that the rising generations aren't poisoned by the theories and hypotheses and ideologies that this established left elite seeks to bring about them. What the left recognizes is, to your point earlier, George, is common sense still remains common. And when you defy common sense, when you defy the laws of logic, and you do so too much, you get over your skis, and you're going to lose the votes of people who have otherwise bought hook, line, and sinker the promulgation of your promotions, your PR campaigns, your propaganda. So they had to retrace their steps in order to win power, but we shouldn't believe for 1 second that they've abandoned those principles as principles worth living. And that is part of the core tenet of what they believe. I think there's a core conviction within them that it's not just about power, it's about power to advance these ideologies that are most dangerous to America being successful and flourishing into the lives of the people. And for that reason, I think that we must make sure that we recognize with sobriety what political victories look like. Political victories are not forever victories. Political victories are very short term. They have to be followed by successful governance, by an agenda that the leaders, to your point, courageously enact for the good of the people, recognizing the political costs that they might have to bear for enacting and advancing some of these truths. But ultimately, it's for the good of the people that they're fighting that battle. And when they do, and when we have a citizenry that is educated in truth, that is established upon Judeo-Christian principles and foundations, that advances the good, beautiful, and true, then those two things work together like a healing balm, like a river that flows properly, that brings out all the corrupt waters that existed and flows in a direction that allows for future generations to benefit from the decisions that were made and the costs that were paid earlier on.
Do you see those leaders on the terrain of American politics today? I'm sure you will refer to J.D. Vance, of course. He's great. I like him very much. But in general, do you see those leaders? Because there was certain lack of leadership through the last 30 years. You are talking about brave people who are doing the necessary, even if it might bring them some losses. And I'm thinking about the first mandate of President Reagan, 1980. He barely won the elections. He started to do what he has to do and what was the right thing to do, budget cuts, tax cuts, getting rid of regulations and everything. And the start was tough. 2 years after he was elected in his first mandate, Republicans lost something like 1/3 of their representatives in Congress. But 2 years after, when people saw what actually was happening, and when they saw that this is basically the right thing to do, he won his second term by a landslide, the biggest victory ever. I somehow feel the lack of such a bravery in the present years. What do you think? Trying to raise the young leaders, the next generation.
Yeah, I do think that it's too early to tell, and I would say if history is our best teacher, then it's more likely than not that we won't succeed at implementing such a tremendous advancement of policies that do represent the good, beautiful, and true. Even though it's a low probability scenario, it doesn't mean that it can't happen at all. In fact, I'm hopeful that it will, even though it's lower probability. That's what we should work for. That's what we should work towards, and those are the kinds of people we should empower and raise up. I do think that we live in a unique moment. What's happened in the past 4 years, thanks to President Trump and thanks to the nomination of the Supreme Court justices, amongst the many other justices throughout our federal system, we now have an American jurisprudence that is night and day different than it was even in 2020, when it was his last year of his presidency, which creates a new landscape off of which we can, with the right amount of courage and the understanding of truth, we can fine-tune policies that will bring about tremendously positive outcomes for our nation in a pretty short order. I mean, we saw in 4 years what the Biden administration did to destroy the incomes and lives of families with really bad policies. I think that ship can be righted pretty quickly, especially the most recent cases on the administrative state and the reduction of the administrative state, the reduction of woke and weaponized budgets, the elimination of a uniparty system that's only tied to its own self-interest. I do think Donald Trump represents the outsiders and the outsiders' perspective, and I think that's one of the reasons why he's really beloved by so many people in places like the backlands of Ohio. He represents that outsider's perspective, and the question becomes, is there a congressional will? Because I think we could have accomplished a lot more in 2016 when Paul Ryan was the speaker if he weren't a functional part of the Unitary Party. I think we would have gone a lot farther if Mitch McConnell weren't just another ornament on the tree of that uniparty faction that has represented basically America since the post-war consensus in the 1940s. So I do think that there's a unique moment that if we have the right majority, there's a chance to make some serious impacts on a political system that we haven't been able to do so since Reagan back in 1984.
What is the American dream looking like today? Has it changed? Because you look like someone who has pretty much achieved it, having your own business, your lovely wife, 4 kids, traveling around the world, teaching, preaching, looking happy, looking good, being in good shape, as I noticed back in Hungary. So you pretty much look like you have achieved it, but of course no one who does ever admits it, so I'm not asking you if you did. But how does it look like? Sell me the American dream today.
Yeah. Well, George, I was just trying to keep up with you, my friend. I'm talking about me. I was trying to keep up with you, and you're traversing all those mountains in Bulgaria with a weighted suit, right?
Yeah, from time to time.
Yeah, that was impressive. Yeah, I think the challenge with any dream itself is a dream without a goal remains a dream. You have to have goals to pursue a dream and define that dream through the lens of those goals. And a goal without a plan remains a goal. So then you have to have a plan that is tied to those goals. I think part of the challenge of how we've defined the American dream is it's been defined by possessions. How much money I have, how much property I have, how much happiness I have in my life. All of those things do not go with us when we leave this earth. If we want to live a life of what I would deem as the American dream, it's going to be one that's built upon joy. Joy is not circumstantial. Because in life, regardless of where you live or how much money you have, you're going to have moments that look like the valley of the shadow of death. But if you have joy from a different plane, from an eternal plane, in an eternal place, and a power of the Spirit of God living inside of you, then regardless of your circumstance, you can be in a prison camp, much like Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and say the best moments of your life were in the gulags. He can only say that because his dream was tied to an eternal source, recognizing the eternal nature of who he was and the eternal nature of his soul. So as I speak with you today and talk about the American dream, my concern is I believe that the dream has become much more about temporal things that gratify the pleasures of a moment, not about the eternal things that elevate the soul. And I believe that family is good evidence to define whether or not the American dream is alive and well. And this is how I would define the American dream as it was originally birthed. And that is that whether or not I have profited the world and lost my soul, or gained the soul and lost the world. If I've gained my soul, if my children are flourishing, if they're walking in the ways of the Lord, if I'm living a righteous life, if I'm the husband of my wife, and I'm treating her the way I'm supposed to, loving her as Christ loved the church, if I'm advancing those principles of truth, if I'm seeking to embody the fruits of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control, I think those are all elements that more better reflect what the American dream ought to look like, in spite of how it's been sold these past 100 years.
That sounds very beautiful and it sounds very noble. But what is the American dream of your competitors? Because I can really not get it. Seeing all the riots and all the cancellation and all the anti stuff, tax the rich, cancel this guy, cancel that guy, don't say this, don't do that, don't look me in the eyes, don't wear this, don't listen to this, don't read this. What are these people dreaming of?
Well, I'd answer this way. Evil cannot exist without good, just like darkness cannot exist without light. Evil is a parasite of the good. So think about this. You can have marriage without divorce, but you can't have divorce without marriage. You can have laws without lawbreakers, but you can't have lawbreakers without laws. You can have light without darkness, but you can't have darkness without light. I think in the same way, those that advance the vision of a leftist worldview, which is largely embodied by critical theory, is only a check on the good. It's a seeking of the destruction of the good. And there's a void in their ability to do anything of creative hope or thought or anything of beauty, because the only reason, the basis of their existence is to be anti-good, anti-light, anti-law. And when that's your rational basis, and even the campaign of Kamala Harris herself, the only thing, you mentioned this, the only thing they can do is talk about how bad Trump is. They can't talk about anything that she advances. I think that would be the dream is destruction. It would be destruction and the elimination of good, light, and truth.
Yeah, but obviously this movement is also attracting millions of people. And some of them, as we mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, are extremely well educated. Those are people who are well aware with how your country is functioning, how the world is functioning. They are pretty well aware of everything around them and still attracted by this thing. I know what America are you dreaming of, and I know if the Republican Party has a total power and total control and works according to its ideas and idealistic view of the world from the Republican point of view, I know how America is going to look like. People will be free, private property will be sacred, you have freedom of economical initiative, make your money, live the life as you're supposed to, do anything that is not hurting me, it's up to you, let's love each other, America will be Christian, people will love each other, and everyone will live in pursuit of happiness. I don't know how they imagined the US if they get total power and total control. How's the country going to look like? What are they fighting for?
Well, I think 2020 was a landmark election in many ways because I think it was the first time, if you look back at the history of, and you could maybe 2016 might be a flavor of this, but it's the first time that I would say that a campaign won purely on the basis of being anti-something. Anti the opposing candidate. Every other campaign throughout the whole of American history before that had to be about something. It had to advance something that gave hope to its people to mobilize them. The Barack Obama campaign of 2008, I mean, those were his words, right? Hope and change.
There were some stuff there that were not, ideally bad, universal health care and stuff like this, we have universal health care system here. I know it's important. I know it can work. Maybe not better than the private one, but at least it can serve the people who cannot afford private health care. So yeah, but there were some ideas, as you mentioned. What are the ideas now? What are the ideas now?
Yeah, well, they're not being shared in large part because they've been tried. They've been tried and they've proven to fail. So they know that doing the same policy ideas over and over again are going to produce the same results. So they have to make their campaign about what the fear level is that they can create within the voters to determine that Trump is Hitler reincarnate, right? That's the statements that we're hearing constantly. We're reenacting the Nazi regime. So it really is another anti-campaign. And the reason that I think they're placing their bets on it is because the first time that happened was really 2020, when the Biden campaign, as he was campaigning from his basement, wasn't going out a lot. They had to be about how dangerous Trump was and how bad he was. Whereas previous campaigns, like the ones we've noted, they incorporated, in addition to their check in opposition of a candidate, they incorporated elements of their policies that they thought would be best for the people.
2020 was different. I totally agree with you, because back then a lot of people voted for Biden just not because they were attracted to him or because they liked him. He was not in such a good shape even back then. They just voted for him because they were convinced that Trump is pure evil. And they really believe that, and they voted anti-Trump. But this campaign is also different because this thing, first of all, the Trump derangement syndrome has kind of faded. It's not that strong anymore. And second of all, saying stuff like Hitler and like Hillary talking that the Madison Square Garden meeting organized by our friend Gavin Wax is a Nazi meeting, it was blatantly crazy. It's stupid. It's idiotic even to say that, because you have first of all, you have the Israeli flags in the audience, and second of all, Trump is the only guy who did not start a single war in his mandate. So it's just stupid. It shows desperation. They have obviously nothing else to say.
That's right. Yeah, I think it's right. I don't think that there's much that can be promoted from their worldview that Kamala Harris in any way, shape, or form represents that would be a virtue. And I think they know that. And they know that her weakness is when they go on and talk to her in interviews where she's asked very fair questions as it relates to her policymaking, there's nothing she can come up with. So her only hope and her shot, her kind of the lane, if I were a consultant for the Kamala Harris campaign, I would probably say the same thing. All you can do is go negative, because there's nothing that is positive that's inspiring about this campaign.
There's pretty much nothing else you can do.
There's nothing else you can do. And I hope you're right, George. I hope that I really hope the American people see that. Polling seems to indicate that. Trump is up in pretty much every swing state. If you look at Real Clear Politics and their polling, he was only down by 0.5 point in Michigan, and that's questionable because he was just up a little while ago. But I really hope the voters see through the facade of what mainstream media has done to partner with the Kamala Harris campaign and the Democratic Party to promote really fear, to promulgate hate, to create division, and to try to divide those that are trying to find a new way outside of these last 4 years, because all of us have felt it. My wife was just talking about this. Our grocery bill is astronomically higher. There was a Heritage Foundation tool that they put out that allowed you to put in where you live, your general income, kind of the size of your household, and to do a comparison of what you would have been paying in 2020 versus what you're paying in 2024. And the statistics are incredible. I would spend on average, someone of my generation, household, and location would spend on average between $50,000 and $70,000 per year more on costs in Ohio. That's untenable. Now, granted, I'm in higher economic status than somebody that's in a lower one, but inflation has been absolutely detrimental. The costs are felt by pretty much everyone.
Do you remain an optimist? Are you an optimist at all? Where do you see America after 10 years, and when do you see yourself? Where's the main share of your ambition pointing? In your private business, in your teaching, in politics? Where do you see yourself in 10 years?
George, I hope my answer to
if your American dreams happens.
I hope the answer to my question is the same, in 10 years as it is today, because my hope is not temporal. My hope's eternal. My hope is in Christ and his salvation, and it's an anchor in the seasons and storms of life as it is in the highs and on the mountains of life. Joy from that eternal source is what gives me the peace that I have to be able to function and to make decisions that don't necessarily seem to reflect the advancement of my own political or personal career, but rather that of my soul and those who surround me. And I hope that my life continues to reflect and embody that, however imperfectly it has been doing so. And as a part of that, we're called to, it's almost like we live paradoxically in life. The life of a believer in Christ is a paradoxical life. I say that because you live in a paradox where you have to have an eternal hope that you're going to be in heaven someday. You're going to be in the presence of God, and it's going to be greater than anything you ever have. But paradoxically, you have to live here in this temporary earth and do everything you can with everything you have to advance and steward the talents that God has given to you. That's paradoxical, because it would seem like the best thing I should do is just move all these talents away and go and focus exclusively on, like Mother Teresa, serving the poor and living in a village that's impoverished and advancing my life in that way. But that's not how the Father designed it. God has given to each of us very unique and distinct talents. And it's our duty as citizens. We can't determine the amount of talents, the depth of those talents, but we can define how we invest those talents. And even in the poor seasons where it seems like investing those talents doesn't make sense, the call of the servant is to be obedient to their master. So in obedience to the Lord, I'm called to invest my talents, even if it means that I'm politically conservative and I live in a deep blue democratic state, but my talent is to advance the good, beautiful, and true. I'm required to do that on the basis of obedience. So it takes a bit of introspection, a lot of prayer, a lot of listening to understand what God's will is for my life. What are the talents that he's given to me? What are the circumstances that surround me in the time that I live, to ascertain what that next step looks like? So 10 years might be a little long for me, but I do hope that by the time I achieve that 10-year mark, and we're talking in 10 years, George, we can talk about how I was faithful to the calling of God in my life. I invested the talents that he's given to me, and I'm living with joy and eternal hope that is shining like a light to all of those who surround me.
And now that's ambitious, feeling complete and everything being in order and being happy with yourself. That's a difficult task, but I wish you do it. Where do you see your country in 10 years?
Ooh, that's a different one. I think.
Or should I ask this one after a week or something?
Yeah. Yes. Actually,
let's leave it for next week.
Let's just say Trump wins. I think, talking to some important members who are influential in our government, I think we need about 12 years. Honestly, I think we need 3 consecutive administrations with power in Congress to really enact all of the policies that would really wholeheartedly 300 or 180 degrees shift from where we're at today, to get the right rulings, to have the right court judicial branch in place, to reset the legislature so Article 1 powers are right, and have executive powers that are limiting the size, scope, and scale of the federal government. So if in 10 years we've had the right leaders who have made courageous decisions, who have led right in policy, I think America will be back at its place as that beacon of hope, that light on a hill, that hope for the nations, where many nations can look to the example of America as something to be aspirational for, as opposed to today, where we have State Department officials all throughout the world forcing nations to carry the rainbow flag Otherwise, they'll defund them. I think we can move towards a position where we're being ambassadors of light and truth and hope. That's my hope. That's my ultimate aim. I think that's unlikely, but that doesn't mean that it's impossible.
I sincerely wish this to you and your great country as well, and to my many friends there. You mentioned the heritage a few times. I hope next week we will have Dr. James Carafano from the Heritage Foundation in our podcast when he finishes another one of his world travels. So those guys are really great. They do a lot of great stuff, a lot of great readings. So to our listeners and viewers, follow Forge, look for Forge, and follow the Heritage Foundations on their websites, because they are publishing really great stuff which you gotta learn and you gotta know in order to better understand the world around you. So, Mr. Jakubowski, thanks very much for your time. I hope I'll see you soon somewhere along the road. All the best in the meantime to you, your friends, your family, and everyone around you. And see you next time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, George. It's been an absolute delight, and I do too. Hope to see you very soon.
See you.